something I struggled with for much of my career was imposter syndrome. And in the last year or so, I've been running some workshops on that topic with a bunch of different people, and understanding that this sense of imposter syndrome presents where we don't conform to the majority kind of norm. I'm a great believer in understanding how our brain, our physiological responses play a part in how we show up, how they impact our behaviour. Sometimes when I'm working with engineers, I'll say to them, get curious about people the same way you are about problems. So we're seeing well-being becoming more of a governance issue rather than nice to have. So what I always say is, if we are operating our business from a place of fear about the metrics or fear of whatever the fear may be, we're actually taking money off the table. Because our people, our brains are compromised, our brains are not working at full tilt. My God, when you're working on deals at 2 a.m, and you've got to get over the line, if you don't have a sense of humour, you're a bit doomed. I would really like people to say that person was an authentic soul.
Every leader has a story to tell, and the Safe Leader podcast uncovers the diversity story behind leading figures championing change to make our world a better place. Join me, your host, Mark McBride-Wright, as we hear from business leaders, academics, entrepreneurs, and agents of change as they share their journeys of innovation, resilience, and transformation. Together, we explore how they embrace the principles of safe leadership, sharing, acting, feeling, and empowering to create safer, more inclusive environments for everyone. Hello, welcome to the next podcast episode of the Safe Leader podcast. I am your host, Mark McBride-Wright, and I am delighted to be joined by Karen Aitchison, Global Head of Wellbeing and a partner at ERM. So Karen is Senior Partner at ERM and brings extensive clinical and educational expertise in mental health and psychosocial risk. She leads ERM's internal efforts focused on health and well-being of its employees. With strong experience as a group facilitator, Karen partners with ERM clients on a wide range of psychosocial risk areas, including leadership development, organizational change, culture, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. She is the lead developer of ERM's Security to Thrive program, which won the 2024 This Can Happen Award for the Best New Workplace Approach to Mental Wellbeing, and has also been nominated for the Wellbeing Leader Award at the upcoming Inside Out Awards, recognizing her contributions to workplace mental health and well-being. Karen, hello.
Hello.
It's been absolutely years, hasn't it? I've not seen you in such a long time.
I know. I follow you a lot and I'm abreast with your kind of career evolution and very proud of what you've achieved, Mark. So I feel like we've not spoken in a long time, but it doesn't feel like we've not connected for a while. So thank you for having me.
I remember leaving my PhD in January 2013 and being welcomed into the family at Environmental Resources Management, ERM. And it was such a great place to start out my career, pre anything on diversity. The business wasn't doing anything on diversity back then. It wasn't really a thing, I guess, actually. 12 years ago, it wasn't as much of a thing in business as it is now. So it's been, by reciprocity, so beautiful to see your career having evolved in that way as well. So if we go back to the early days, then let's go back to the young Karen. Are you doing now what you thought you would be doing back in your younger years?
Gosh. Probably not. But if I reflect on my younger years, it makes a lot of sense that I am doing it. If that makes so, I started my career as a lawyer in a big commercial firm in Scotland, and I mean I loved it, and I think it's what took me into sustainability. I was an environmental lawyer, and but I think the thing that the red thread through my whole career has been people. And I came to a point in my career subsequent to there, but probably around about ERM time when I met you, where I was really drawn to understanding how people thrive in the workplace, because I was working in a very fast-paced part of our business in the M&A team, and I was leading that team, and I was recognizing people were going through different stages of their life. There was a kind of analogy of work hard, play hard in M&A. And then people started having kids, and people started trying to get on the property ladder, and people started to get married, and life was sort of unfolding, and the pressure that then came from sustaining that kind of role and that focus, client focus, it's a demanding space to be in. I realized that people really needed a little bit more support around work-life balance.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating. And so then so you could see then as the culture of the company was changing based on the workforce that was in, as they were moving through years, you could see a need for the culture of the company to flex, to adapt, to change. Otherwise, there was a risk of a tranche of people who were building this fast moving bit of the business. It's a business risk to not support it almost.
I think so, yeah. I think I was looking to see how we could bring more balance in, and recognizing that life events don't always go smoothly. And very sadly, people struggle with fertility. People, sadly go through miscarriages. People go through events as we mature. I mean, obviously we go through events potentially all through our life, but I was acutely aware of some of the more immediate challenges that I was supporting in my team, and thinking, gosh, how do we accommodate the space for humans to go through these events and deliver to a high performance in the workplace? So yeah, I felt like that was something that we needed to dig into.
There must have been that trust, though, from the foundation beforehand for your colleagues to even be sharing those things, for you to then build upon. Did that happen organically? Do you feel, does that happen organically in leadership? How you build relationships with your people? And do you think some leaders are better than others at that?
I definitely think some are better than others. I think you work with what you've got. And I mean, I was very blessed to have a team who I think during that work hard, play hard period had built a lot of trust and what I'd call psychological safety. Yeah. For me as a leader, it was more about how can I complement that existing sense of safety that exists? How can I create more of it through my presence and through my ability to listen? And yeah, I think if I'm honest, some leaders really struggle with that part. I think there's generational differences, and you and I are both Scottish, and I don't know about you, but there's a sort of Presbyterian part in us that's sort of, we're quite stoic, or can be quite stoic. It's sort of seen as a bit of a badge of honour, and to be vulnerable in some respects for me as a Scottish person sits in opposition to what I've been raised to do.
Yeah.
So it can be challenging to tap into that more emotional side of your leadership.
Totally. The hardened highlands of the rain and the stone. Yeah, it's the reputation we have on the international stage. Like, I'm living in New York now, so everyone has got some sort of connection to some Celtic background, whether it be Irish or Scottish, and they're always really interested in their ancestry. So I think we give ourselves a bad rep, maybe. You know, we do have quite a strong international reputation. So how do you think your Scottish roots then have affected the kind of leader that you've become?
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's pros and cons, I think, to that for me. The pros, I mean, I definitely think humour has been a kind of consistent thread throughout. And my God, when you're working on deals at 2 in the morning, and you've got to get over the line, if you don't have a sense of humour, you're a bit doomed. I think there's something about, there is a, I've just recently moved back to the east coast of Scotland and I'm surrounded by incredible beaches. And there's something very grounding for me,
Yeah.
literally, about putting my feet in the sand. And that's a privilege that I have. So there's an earthiness, there's a groundedness, I think, to the Scots, because I think we do have a strong connection to the landscape and to our environment. So there's a hardiness to that I think, resilience maybe is the word that I'm looking for. There's a resilient part in me. And I do still challenge sometimes the idea that resilience for me is not just an individual quality, it's a systemic kind of piece as well. I think that, well-being is often, and maybe in the last 10 years or so, has been quite focused on the individual and individual resilience and, building that and investing in self-care and all of that. But I think that if we were to go back to the roots of our heritage, Mark, we're missing an opportunity to think about the real power of community.
Yes.
And, they say this, and you'll know this with young children, it takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah.
I think that applies to organizations now, that we're not biologically designed to be so independent and so individualistic in the way that we show up. I think that building community and building teams, as you would say in an organization, is fundamental to our ability to thrive. No man is an island, as they say. And I feel like, I'm seeing that in safety, I'm seeing that in culture transformation, that we need each other more than ever. And I think, given what's going on in the world right now, geopolitically, we've never needed each other more. And finding our people and finding that ability to rely and to share some of the load is also really good for our well-being, because a lot of us are running on a lot of cortisol. Stress is high. And when we share the load of our stress, something shifts for us, I think, and it dilutes a little bit some of the pressure.
And also helps then increase trust, build trust when it's then received well by someone else.
Yes.
And that sharing of whatever the root cause that may have been that led to that cortisol spike, there might be then a welcome ear in the person that hears it and an element of relatability. And all of a sudden you're then connecting on something that you had no idea that you had. This is a shared experience or dilemma.
Yeah, I really agree. And to give you an example of that, something I struggled with and for much of my career was imposter syndrome. And in the last year or so, I've been running some workshops on that topic with a bunch of different people. So with women who traditionally are seen to suffer from this more than others, but working with LGBTQ+, working with our Latin American colleagues, and understanding that this sense of imposter syndrome presents where we don't conform to the majority kind of norm. And it's been fascinating to really expand that understanding of that feeling of not being good enough or not being part of the group, if that makes sense. And so that sort of thing, I find sharing and bringing some vulnerability to that conversation has allowed people to say, oh my God, it's not just me that feels this way. And something shifts for them because they see in themselves in others. And the conversation then becomes a lot richer. And I feel that people then feel less shame around reaching out for support because they recognize other people feel the same way as they do.
And how are you inverting that experience for then the majority group to feel similarly?
yeah, that's always a challenge, isn't it? Really trying to challenge the idea of allyship, and kind of turning things on its head a little bit and asking the majority to step in more. So, I'm a woman, obviously a white woman in business. I'm a gay woman, so I have some understanding of discrimination. And what I found really works as well for me is some of the people who have really taken the time to get to know me and be curious about my journey, be curious about where I've met with resistance or met with challenges.
Yeah.
The more that I've been able to explore that with them, the more I've seen them step in. And so what we're trying, I think, to do now is, and I'm encouraged by it in our own organisation, the number of allies that join our employee resource group sessions, etc., with a view to learning how they can begin to advocate more, how they can step in more, so that the group that's underrepresented is not doing all the heavy lifting themselves. And I think we're on a journey, and I think most organisations are probably on a journey with that. But I am encouraged to see a lot more people with the privilege sort of, or privilege, maybe a wrong word, but the kind of maybe sitting in the majority position in the organisation, stepping into those uncomfortable situations and speaking up.
Yeah. And it's amazing to hear about the learning that's happening from within. And then when you bring that to the, because it can be a force for bonding as well with business development, with clients, and when I read out your introduction there, it sounds like it's actually become, it's not just an internal focus, your role, it's also external. You're working with clients, doing leadership development, team building, culture transformation work. So how is that going? Like, what's a sort of typical project that you might work on, for example, with a client?
So that program that you referenced at the beginning, Security to Thrive, is sort of based on 3 pillars, and what the first one is neuroscience. I'm a great believer in understanding how our brain, our physiological responses play a part in how we show up, how they impact our behaviour. The second pillar of that is really applying more of a systemic lens to challenges that we find in organisations. So if we don't really get to root cause analysis and understand the intricate web of the organisation, we'll probably only solve part of the problem. And the third pillar is on DE&I. And for me, we cannot work with clients on any safety, culture transformation, leadership development if we don't address that piece, and recognising that the more global the organisation, and most of the organisations I work with are global, the more likely it is to have a demographic that's pretty diverse. So the work that I do often sort of centres DE&I in it, even if it's not it's not overtly in it. It will always be in it for me. Examples of the kind of work I do are supporting teams who are in conflict, for example. Maybe they're going through a transformation or a change, and what we know about that is quite often certain people find that a fearful experience, or they get a little bit paralyzed in it. They find that that they start to be fearful of the impact that transformation may have on them from an economic point of view, from a status point of view, from job security, whatever. And then you've got people who are like gung-ho and they're up for change. And so how do we help the enablers of change work with the ones who are a little bit distracting from it? And using the neuroscience to really create a roadmap of understanding about the core emotions that we all carry within us as human beings, and why some of us are activated more into fear, whereas some of us are activated more into kind of, we can do this. And also recognizing the difference that we all have through lived experience. For example, if I'm someone who's experienced a lot of change in my childhood, maybe my parents worked overseas, and every 2 years I got moved around, and it created a degree of anxiety for me. That's not going to change because I've moved into an organization. Yes. I carry that with me, potentially. And so something like a transformation process could be quite triggering for me. It could be something that might set me into a bit of a spiral. So how do we help leaders of these teams going through these transformations to understand all the natural responses that we're going to have as human beings to change, and then work through them and process them. Yeah.
I can imagine a lot of people don't then just take this learning and apply it just within their work frame of reference. They're they're doing some soul searching on, you know, what's their trigger points, how were they brought up, what and they apply it then to their own history, but also their own personal life, like their relationship with their children, how they're raising their kids. It's very self-discovery, isn't it?
It is. And I mean, look, I trained in London for 5 years as a psychotherapist, and I'm very aware of the boundaries of that versus the role that I'm in now. So I probably should caveat by saying we're not taking people down some deep, dark therapeutic process, but neuroscience allows us to just lean in a bit more into our own human experience, without going into a place that could be challenging or difficult. But even just knowing that we all have these core circuitry in our brain around panic and fear, but also joy. You know, play is a circuit in our brain. Care is a circuit. So that's what prompts us to be empathic. Knowing that we all have this available to us, I think, is a great framework to kind of hang some of this on. And yeah, we've had some aha moments that have been really beautiful to witness. And people, absolutely taking it away and thinking about it in the context of family and community and, you know, parenting, etc. And that's been wonderful to see them kind of apply the learning to that. But we are boundaried around it. It's not, we're not doing personal therapy by any stretch or group therapy.
Absolutely. And so you've had experience in environmental sustainability, now in well-being. Well-being and environmental social governance are sometimes spoken about separately, but how do you see them intersecting, and is it coming up still in board level conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Mark, that they have historically been kind of treated as almost separate conversations, but as you know, they're deeply interconnected. And especially, I think, when we talk about sustainable performance and long-term value creation. So, I mean, the E often gets the spotlights. There's a lot of talk right now about climate and emissions and reporting and this stuff. But I think that what I'm seeing certainly is investors and stakeholders increasingly making that connection between well-being, employee well-being to risk, productivity, reputation. And I think that, you know, sadly, some organizations have been exposed to the risks that come from a burnt out, disengaged workforce, and they now recognise that as a material business risk. So we're seeing well-being becoming more of a governance issue rather than nice to have. And for those organisations that I am lucky enough to work with who are progressive, they're really seeing this integration of well-being into ESG is non-negotiable. It's not an option. It's more a part of how do we deliver resilient, responsible, high performance. And so it's been great to see the shift. And I think that probably I've seen more of a turning towards that since COVID. I think as human beings in organizational life, we really stepped into quite a special place in COVID. Now, don't get me wrong, it was horrendous. But we started to really humanize ourselves. You know, I feel like we were really checking in on each other. Everything was being done online. And I don't think I was privy to any meetings where people didn't say, "How are you all?"
Yeah.
You know, and something shifted a little bit, I think, in terms of humanizing the workplace and humanizing our clients and our colleagues in a way that perhaps we'd lost sight of prior to the pandemic. And I think that because we're seeing phenomenon such as burnout, which is a wholly attributable phenomenon to work, the WHO has made that very clear. It's not burnout. It's not something that happens to us in our private life. It's something that can happen to us in work. And also the shift towards systemic understanding of the hazards that exist in the workplace that can give rise to psychological harm. We're seeing also shift in legislation and in regulatory frameworks that's driving some of this discussion as well.
If you have a client that's the engineer or they've made their way up, and they just want hard numbers, metrics. They want something that they can see a change on. And well-being is, you can't measure that, can you? Are there some metrics, hard metrics that you can set that are tracked? And if so, what are they?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Deloitte has been banging on about this for quite some time, that, you can measure absenteeism, presenteeism rates. You can drill down into some of the data. I think organizations are now looking at doing, back in the day, Mark, we would have had like a survey, if we were lucky, every couple of years. And that's a snapshot in time of how are you doing. You're seeing a lot more pulse survey kind of activity, which is really taking, stock of what's happening more in real time. I think it's still an evolving space. We can look at things like the take up for the employee assistance program. HR function is playing more of a role in tracking data. Is it as mature as we would like it to be at this stage? Probably not, but I do think we're seeing a lot more organizations sort of flooding the market with the technology to do that. You've got to measure. I don't have a problem with measure. But the idea that well-being isn't a major factor, I think you only need to look at the generation coming into the workplace now, and looking at what some of the demands, if you like, that they have of an employer. You and I think probably were just pleased to get a job. Back in, I'm older than you, but in the 90s, I was like, I've got a job, great. I didn't think about well-being or anything to do with it.
Yeah, sure.
But now there's, a much more educated generation coming through. They recognize the long-term health impacts of stress. They understand that work-life balance is something that they prioritize. And so as an employer of choice, it's important that you're not well-being washing, that you are legitimately offering meaningful interventions that support sustainable, careers in your organization. So the demand, I think, is driving also the supply that's coming from the organizations themselves.
Interesting. I think it's knowing the talk track to give internally or externally to whoever it is you're trying to influence. Like, what is the thing that's going to influence them? Is it the metric side? Is it the hard nosed cash, like return on like value? Is it the talent risk of not attracting the best talent? And for some, it's just the experiential element. Like they just need to experience it themselves, and then when they see they've been neglecting their well-being and it's then showed up in their performance, or they've been at the risk of burnout, all of a sudden it's like, oh my goodness, I need to now recalibrate here. And thankfully, I'm in an organization that has the structures for that.
Something that I learned in my training that has stayed with me is that, and it's linked to, I think you've been talking a lot, I've noticed on LinkedIn, about psychological safety and the importance of that. What I learned is that when we operate at work from a place of social engagement, connection, collaboration, and we feel psychologically safe, we free our brain up to really come through with innovative solutions, and we're much better at problem solving, and we're just more engaged.
Yes.
When we're operating out of stress or from prolonged periods of stress isn't in itself a bad thing. It's just that prolonged periods are not so great. We start to conserve our oxygen into the body, and we go into a fight-flight response, which we don't actually control. But the minute we move into fight-flight, the blood and oxygen sort of moving to the limbs, literally ready to fight or flight.
Yeah.
And we're taking it away from up here, this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which we need to be online if we're going to be innovative and creative. So what I always say is, if we are operating our business from a place of fear about the metrics, or fear of, whatever the fear may be, we're actually taking money off the table. Because our people, our brains are compromised. Our brains are not working at full tilt. If we're not rested as well, if we're not eating and hydrating and all those kind of things, the likelihood is that we might be sat in front of our desk for 8 hours straight, but we're producing low quality outputs.
Yeah.
Whereas if we are able to build rest and repair into our life and our day, if we're able to take that lunch hour walk or go and chat with a friend or whatever it might be, the likelihood is the productivity rate will go up, our ability to access really good ideas and thoughts will emerge. And so it's in businesses' interest to actually care about the well-being of their people if they want to stay at the forefront of their field. They want to have the edge. Then the edges keep your people well.
Yeah. No, totally. So with well-being then, and where do you see the future? Where is the sector heading?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's leaving behind this idea of mental health is something that only certain people have to deal with. The rest of us are just fine. I think it's moving away from, if you are struggling with your mental health, here's the EAP or here's HR, to a place where we're looking at how do we create thriving environments for people, and what are the barriers to those thriving environments that we as the workforce or the employer are actually inadvertently creating. So when we look at for example, what's happening in Australia, they have quite progressive legislation around what they call psychosocial hazards. They're looking at things like demands of work. Are they too high? Are they too low? Autonomy in our roles. Do we have too much autonomy, too little? Interpersonal conflict. Do the line manager relationship, is that healthy or is that problematic? And I think when we start to understand that these hazards do exist, and back to DE&I, that some of them exist more for certain groups than others, we can start to look at ways to mitigate and eliminate them, and that will start to create more of a preventative response to mental health problems than a reactive one.
Yeah.
So I think that's where I'm hopeful we're moving across the spectrum of reactivity to preventative. And I think the other piece is that we're really understanding the importance of a systemic lens rather than just individual kind of heal yourself type thing.
Yes.
And look at the ways in which the structure of the organization lends itself towards thriving or surviving mentality in the workplace.
And so I guess a leader or a team's stepping stones to that world is a combination then of the tools, the tech that you referred to that's now coming out into the marketplace, what's available, how are we using, what are we using, how are we then operationalizing that, what's the data we're getting from that, how are we then feeding it? It's almost like looking at the system that is our workplace, and the envelope that you draw around what you're considering could be the business itself, but then also the business and its supply chain relationships. It could be as narrowed down like as an office, like a singular office, a site. So office manager taking this on, for the culture locally. And then all these people thinking in this way and then sharing what they're learning, getting it all out with what all the like the reactive responses that we've been having, what can we shift to then be proactive and then address these measures? And then there's always going to be things that we can't anticipate or that might show up. So what's our reactive measures for that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's important to say that I am not suggesting that there will not be people who legitimately struggle with their mental health in the workplace for reasons that we don't need to necessarily go into. And I would never want them to not be able to access the support and help that they need. So I'm not saying that we can prevent all mental health decline in the workplace. Of course we can't. That would be naive of me. I do think it's important that we look at the stigma that still exists in certain pockets, certain jurisdictions, and certain demographics around mental health, and that psychoeducation continues. But I think there's an element of the workforce, again post-COVID, where we've kind of gone into overdrive in a way. I mean, just listening to my clients, I hear this tension of productivity demand going up and, overwhelm and whatnot. So there is this component of, okay, if there is a way to use what science tells us, what's sort of, particularly for me, neuroscience tells us about how to create these more thriving workplaces, and you're touching into that when you look at psychological safety, we can build more resilient workplaces, where people, when we can come into a place and feel authentic and be who we are. Like, I know a lot of DE&I work is around bring your authentic self to work. It has a physiological positive response when we are able to bring our authentic self to work, because we're not trying to edit who we are. We're not trying to keep that under wraps, because it's exhausting. I don't know your story, but I know mine. And certainly as a lawyer, if I had come out, it would have been in the early 90s, it would have been career limiting for me. And I was so grateful when I moved into consultancy that they just seemed to be much more comfortable with it. But I was running on a lot of stress of being outed at work. So just me as an example tells you that, I wasn't working optimally. I was probably pretty stressed. And there's a lot worse stories than mine out there. So if we can create that safer place to show up at work, then that will also reduce some of the challenges that people encounter, and perhaps some of the reasons they don't always come to work or they struggle at work.
Absolutely. I very much nowadays as a practitioner have brought my learnings that I got from ERM and then subsequently Granhern, where I moved to after ERM, when I did a good five or 6 years as practicing as a process safety engineer, learning all of risk management, helping create physically safe working environments, mitigation, preventative barriers, mitigation barriers. This is the language of technical safety, of process safety. So retooling that, therefore, and speaking to engineers who are oftentimes in the majority group as well, because we've got a massive gender imbalance in engineering. It's a way to speak to them then about these more less tangible elements of identity, mental health, well-being. And so that's really been the arc of my career since I left DRM. I've built on that foundation. We've done research on masculinity in engineering and found that men also find it hard to challenge the hypermasculine norms that's expected of them in the workplace environment. So even the ability to be vulnerable and to show up and to share about anything that's going on beneath their waterline that might be the root cause that drives a high incident rate of suicidal ideation and self-harm that affects the extreme end, that affects men. This again, this is like a risk management strategy. It's likelihood, it's probability. Where is this happening? And in ERM, we would be helping clients design out risk, eradicate risk, and it's so heartening, therefore, to hear that you're now helping clients focus on that psychological safety element, to be tabling like the cultural side of things, because they're both important. But for technically wired people who want to focus on the technical stuff, they think that that's more important than the cultural interpersonal element, and it actually all needs to be addressed in tandem.
And I think you're absolutely right. And I hope I don't offend anyone at ERM, but the technical brilliance at ERM is a massive asset. I mean, of course it is. And leadership is also about how we create the conditions for other people to succeed. So sometimes when I'm working with engineers, I'll say to them, get curious about people the same way you are about problems. Because, you're trying, see the relationships around you as part of the system that you're leading, and maybe use terminology that's a little bit more resonant for them. But when we connect with people as leaders, it's I think there's maybe an old school thinking it's very much about charisma and stuff, but for me it's really about intention. And I think you can connect with technical leaders in a way that allows them to flourish as people leaders as well. And sometimes I find explaining the reasoning, and this is why I find neuroscience actually very powerful, because neuroscience isn't gendered, and it also isn't following the old school way of thinking that you're a left brain or you're a right brain or you're a blue or a purple or whatever.
Yeah.
It's saying, well, we all have this sort of circuitry in common, male or female, doesn't matter, or anything in between. It sort of, it kind of takes the heat out of some of that a bit.
Yeah, completely. It makes it it de-identifies it. It makes it rational, you know, it makes it neutral, it makes it fact-based, you know.
And it reduces a little bit of the defensiveness that sometimes can come up. And I love it as well because there are certain sort of psychometric tests that are still widely used. And people often will take great pride in telling you what color they are or whatever quadrant or whatever. And I think that can create a fixedness in us, that, and also a kind of justification for why we're not doing the people side. Well, I'm not the emotion, I don't have the emotional brain. And you kind of can call them on that when you introduce much more contemporary neuroscience and say, well, actually, that's not true. We all have access to a care circuit in our brain that is what triggers empathy. It's just, how do you want to activate it and see what happens, rather than that part of me sort of is not accessible. So I enjoy neuroscience as a challenging tool as much as anything else, but it certainly has been wonderful to see. I mean, I worked recently with a financial director on this stuff, and you know, I probably went into that group thinking the finance director is going to be the hardest sell here. And he was blown away by it, and he was like, this has changed how I think about metrics, you know, not to the extent that he's thrown them out, but it just really opened his eyes to there's other ways that we can engage people on the numbers.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that. So what kind of legacy then would you love to leave at ERM and across the wider consultancy industry?
Good question. I'm getting there in age. I mean, I think I'm in my last decade of my career. What legacy? I would.
You can work until any age. There is no.
I know. Well, traditionally, I'm in the last decade. Then maybe. I would love to have made a difference, and I'm not entirely sure I can articulate what my legacy what would I want it to be. I would really like people to say that person was an authentic soul. And I learned a lot. I felt like she was an advocate, that she was an ally, that she stepped in. I would really like people to remember me as a mentor. Insofar as, you know, it's interesting, your question earlier around, you know, how did you kind of navigate being a woman in the workplace, and I think that as a white woman, as I understand it, I'm one of the biggest beneficiaries of the DE&I movement, and therefore it is incumbent upon me to amplify the voices of women who are not white, and women who and I'm very proud of some of the work that I've done in ERM, and I'm very proud of ERM for having the programs available. But I don't know if you remember, we had an Aspire program, but we also now have a LEAD program, and LEAD is all about elevating underrepresented voices and underrepresented groups, if that makes sense. So I help deliver some training around psychological safety for the sponsors, but also for the people being sponsored, to understand what that means for them in that journey they go on together. So yeah, I feel like the legacy would be that in some shape or form I've helped to support and develop the generation that will take over ERM after I'm long gone.
I don't. I remember the activation points for me on my journey to discovering diversity. and speaking to you, I do remember, starting to look like trying to find more LGBT role models that were in the business. And I remember some programming that we did. It was pre any diversity strategy though of ERM. There was nothing like concrete and part of the business strategy in that. But I do remember then graduate, because I think I had just gotten married actually, or it was a few
Yeah, I think
years
you
I'd
have.
gotten married. Yeah, it was like way before we had kids, and way before I did any diversity work. I hadn't co-founded Engineering at that point. It was about 3 years before that. But I think like the initial things I started doing at ERM, or maybe some of the initial conversation, or even just that hunt to try and find the other
The
me,
others.
the others of me in the office was a bit telling in and of itself, with then their a group. I think we had an event once actually, didn't we? And we had some drinks in the office. And then that was that really was like, oh wow, great. There are people like me that are here. I even noticed actually that ERM's changed its logo on LinkedIn with the progress flag colors. I thought that's brilliant. That's cool to see an organization actually doing that this month.
This month is obviously Pride Month, and we're
but
out in force.
I think I'm one of those people that you have like started an interest in this stuff for. Like I do remember some of the conversations that we had like earlier, and it really like opened my eyes to like, the needs for doing work in this area. It's definitely been one of the experiences on the journey of where I'm at now that was you're like an early influencer in my shift in trajectory as I went on in my technical years under my belt so I could get my chartership and all that. When I then discovered my love for more cultural based work, my experiences at ERM are sort of one of my reference points, and when like just ERM embracing flexible working before it was a proper thing, being able to go up to the Manchester office to see Suzanne and everyone, I felt really included. Being able to go up to Edinburgh on a Thursday evening and work remotely from the beautiful office that we had at the time, right by the castle, and like not have to take a day's leave or holiday to do that. Just the trust was there to do it. It was, it was really, it was inspiring and empowering. So, yeah, I owe a lot to those early days in the
The
start.
office is still there, and it's a beautiful location. And I think what you're leaning into a bit here is representation and the importance for those of us who identify as being slightly different to, the majority. And ERM, I think you'd be pretty proud of the journey that we've been on and that we continue to invest in, and that representation is moving to a much healthier place for me. I mean, you talk about engineering and it being a male dominated environment. Yeah, I'm really proud. I think if you were to come back and visit, you'd say, okay, there's some good stuff happening here. And yeah, I mean, I think those of us who maybe are at the pioneering end of it are looking for our people. We're just looking to know we're not the only one. And it's amazing what grassroots movements do in that regard. And I think, I'm proud of ERM in the sense that there's sponsorship from the top, and there's this real investment in the grassroots, employer resource groups, etc. And the move to allyship and advocacy and amplification that we must have, because if people in underrepresented groups only have one another, then nothing really changes in the system, and the system has to respond. So I'd say we're on that, we're moving along the maturity curve there really well. And I think there's more people willing to name their difference.
Wonderful. Well, I'll have to come back for a visit, definitely. Okay, quick fire questions. You're not getting off the hook. Okay, what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
I mean, Wow, I've received a lot, but I think for the purpose of this conversation, um, it's probably something along the lines of in in life and probably in leadership, it's the quieter, more intuitive part of us rather than the analytical voice that sees the bigger picture, and trusting that intuition has changed, I think, how I've led teams, how I've listened, and probably how I've kind of grown as a person, leaning into that more. Yeah.
What's the most proudest moment in your career so far?
Being asked to do this role and winning the award, because Security to Thrive, which is the program that I kind of led on, I'm immensely proud of that.
What's one skill every leader should learn?
That they've got 2 ears and 1 mouth.
Coffee or tea?
Neither. Never had either in my life. Neither. Yeah.
What's your go-to well-being practice?
The beach.
If
Walking up on the beach.
If you could have dinner with any Scottish leader or thinker, who would it be?
It would be a man called Ian McGilchrist, who is a neuro science expert. I think he's a psychiatrist as well. And he wrote a book called The Master and His Emissary, and it talks about the 2 hemispheres of our brain and what they do. He lives on the Isle of Skye now.
Okay. What's the one thing you do to reset when things feel overwhelming?
Breathe.
What's one book or podcast you'd always recommend?
Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
What's a lesson you think more people should learn earlier in their careers?
I think they should learn to expose themselves to the leadership styles of as many people as possible, so that they don't just become a clone of the one that they tend to work with the most, and that they also help form their own identity through that process, rather than kind of just falling into a kind of pattern of this is the way we do things around here.
Wow, great advice. Finally then, what advice would you give to your younger self walking into your first boardroom?
To be intentional about when I did open my mouth, and to not worry that what was going to come out my mouth wasn't going to make sense.
That's great advice. That is great advice for all of us at any point in life, actually. Thank you so much, Karen. If people want to get in touch with you, if they want to find out more about your work, some of the programs that you've mentioned, how do they do that?
So I'm on LinkedIn, and I can send you I think you have that. My email is karen.aitchison, AITCHISON @erm.com. That's probably the easiest way. Fabulous.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been a little trip down memory.
It has.
Well, I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for having me.
You have been listening to the Safe Leader podcast, uncovering the diversity story behind leading figures, championing change to make our world a better place. If you have enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to the Safe Leader podcast on your podcast platform of choice and get notified when a new episode goes live. Did you know that we also offer a full transcript on each of our podcast episodes? Check out my website, McBride-Wright.com. Here, you can also explore the training, coaching, and keynote speaking services I offer. And whilst you're there, why not join the Safe Leader community by subscribing to the Safe Leader Insights mailing list? Thank you for listening, and please come back and join us on a future episode.